This is a recording from a Sunday meeting of the BC Humanist Association in Vancouver. The opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of the BCHA or its board of directors. To learn more about humanism and to support our work, visit bchumanist.ca, and make sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and be sure to subscribe to the BC Humanist podcast.
And today we have Ujjal Dosanjh, who's a lawyer, a former NDP MLA, and BC Premier, and a Liberal Member of Parliament, and brings years of experience in all kinds of areas to us this morning. So I would like to welcome you.
Thank you. Well, you know, you write a blog and you end up as a speaker here. That's exactly what I did, and that was, I made a note of that because I usually forget sort of saying things, and I don't do written speech, but I made a note of that because I think it was Ian that called me. I had done a blog on my blog site, ujjaldosanjh.org, about 6 months ago, I think. I can't remember the month or the date, on a celebration on Parliament Hill where there was a religious ceremony around Vaisakhi, which is sort of April 13th, the day the last guru of Sikhs gave them the turban and the beard and those symbols. And I had no particular concern about the celebration, although that's questionable as well from my perspective, because Parliament is the secular sanctum sanctorum of our country, and I think that it's important to protect that sanctity of it being secular. But what really had bothered me, and this is not to criticize my good friend Justin, because he was a member of Parliament with me for a couple of years when I was there, but it is simply to express concern. What he had done that day at the celebration, he attended, which is fine, although I will come to that later on as well. But he made a statement about an upcoming apology about the Kamagata Maru, that he was going to make an apology in the House. And he made that announcement at that celebration on Parliament Hill. And I thought that was not a very good thing for a Prime Minister to do. There were several errors. First of all, Kamagata Maru, he said he was going to extend the apology to the Sikh community for Kamagata Maru. And firstly, Kamagata Maru was not a Sikh pilgrimage to a religious Canada. It was a bunch of Indians, most of whom happened to be of Sikh faith, who had come as economic migrants, as have millions of others over time to Canada. And several of them were Hindus and Muslims. I think there were one or two Christians as well from Punjab. I don't have the exact numbers, they're not really important. And I felt that as politicians, I don't believe he was expressly pandering, but that's what it felt like. It felt wrong that you have celebration, a religious celebration, and then you actually mischaracterize an event, a historical event, and say, I'm going to extend the apology to the Sikh community, which kind of doubled the error as far as I was concerned. So I wrote a blog saying that it's very dangerous not to be aware when politicians mix religion with politics, and that the principle of separation of church and state, which took centuries to evolve, is a very important principle. I was born and raised in India, in a Sikh family, but my maternal grandfather, who spent many years in British Indian jails fighting for the independence of the country, was a religious man. He started out singing freedom songs from religious stages, and then went on to become a radical, a communist, and remained a communist to his dying days. Not to say that he didn't believe, I mean, you know, India is full of contradictions. Not to say that he didn't believe in some kind of a God, but he was very clear that whatever he believed about that should not interfere in how he views the government or society as a whole, that was a personal belief. And from my perspective, you know, one can argue with people about what they should believe or shouldn't believe. What's more important than that, as a person who has been in government and in politics, what's very important for me is that we kept those beliefs that we might have about creation or not creation or evolution, we keep them away from the business of the state, that we don't, not to say that you ignore science, but to simply say that state should be equidistant from all faiths of that nature, all beliefs of that nature. In a place like India where I grew up, they view secularism as different. People like Nehru, when the country first became independent, viewed secularism very differently. It evolved over time that their politicians believe that you are secular if you go to all the temples and mosques and churches and you exclude no one from your religious pilgrimages. I think that's antithetical to how secularism should be. Secularism should mean that state is equidistant. The emphasis should be on distance between separation between church and state. Because otherwise, what you're doing is you're pandering here, you're pandering there. I mean, I've seen, and Justin isn't the only culprit in this. Most politicians do this. They will go to mosque one day and Gurdwara the next day. A Buddhist pagoda the following day. But what irks me as someone who's been looking at that kind of politics in this country for a long time is that I never see any politician go to a Christian church of any importance and say that I'm coming to a Christian church, which actually makes it into pandering. If you go to all the other places, but you don't go to a Christian church. And that's where the problem is, because what happens with immigrants, and I've been thinking about this a lot, when immigrants are uprooted, taken out of their daily context of the lives they had lived before they come to a place like this, what becomes a lot more important for them was usually something that was of passing interest in the home they came from. For instance, if you ask a Syrian in Syria, they will tell you they're Syrians. If you ask a Syrian here, they would generally say, I'm a Muslim Canadian, not a Syrian Canadian. If you ask Punjabis or Indians generally, many of the Sikh Canadians have become Sikh Canadians rather than Indian Canadians or Punjabi Canadians. What happens is that you take them out of their roots and the social context and the cultural milieu they live in. They cling to something that they think they understand. They may not necessarily understand religion, but they think they do because they know all the rituals. They go to all the congregations, and so they cling to that which they think they know, and that then begins to generally, if not absolutely exclusively, I would say exclusively, begins to define their lives in a country like Canada. And that, in fact, and the Canadian politicians fall into that trap. They, if you ask Justin Trudeau, I don't know what his faith is, maybe a Catholic, maybe something else, But if you ask him, is he a Catholic, first and foremost? Is he a Catholic Canadian? Or is he a French Canadian? I'm sure he'd say he's a French Canadian. He wouldn't say he's a Catholic Canadian. But it's pretty easy for him and other politicians to come to Indian community and say, you're a Sikh Canadian, you're a Hindu Canadian, you're a Muslim Canadian. And it is a vicious circle then that begins to compartmentalize a population by religion. And that is very, very dangerous for a multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-faith country like Canada. I'm not, I don't argue about people's faith. People ask me, when I first got elected in 1991, one of the journalists asked me how I defined myself, and I still remember. I said, I'm a Canadian citizen, I'm an Indian by heritage, I'm Punjabi by language, mother tongue. If at all anyone is interested, I was born and raised in a Sikh family. But that's my private life. That's nothing to do with who I am. That's what, and I think that's the politics in Canada is on a very dangerous and a slippery slope. When politicians feel the need always to go to a mosque or a gurdwara or a pagoda to say we like you, and we're and that really worries me, because in India we see the effects of what's happening. Politicians go to all different places and they get these little, spots put on their foreheads, or they go to the Golden Temple and they put a turban on, and they pretend to be one with all the minorities. Why can't they be one with all the minorities based on the needs of the community, based on social justice and equality and all of the things that make this country what it is? And I was on a trip to India. I just came back. I was launching the Indian edition of my autobiography, and people asked me there, and I was worried with the emphasis on Hindutva, sort of people being Hindus. It's a majority Hindu country, and the Prime Minister of the country is not de-emphasizing that. All of his followers, they are on, beef vigilantes or cow vigilantes, and they are, for instance, they were beating people up, Dalits, who have been skinning dead cows for centuries as the lowest caste in the hierarchy, were certainly beaten up because they were skinning dead cows. And they turned it around. What they did in protest, they started bringing dead cows and dropping them in front of the Hindu temples and say, "You Brahmins, you now skin the dead cows." But what I'm saying is that when religion begins to become important in the affairs of the state, in the politics of the country, in the way the politicians appeal to people of different faiths, then we're on a very dangerous and slippery slope. I used to go to the temples and speak about issues before 1984. 1984 made me realize that you don't want to go to the temples and speak about politics, because 1984 in Canada and in India we saw the dangerous potent mix of religion and politics do a lot of violence and create a lot of problems for people. And so you wouldn't catch me dead making a political speech in a temple. If they want me to go and say hi, I'd be happy to go and say hi. So I think that's how the conversation started, and I was happy to come here and just be part of the crowd and talk about this issue, because it actually concerns me. And I say that again, Justin Trudeau isn't the only culprit. Most politicians, from low to high, big time to small time politicians, actually unthinkingly do this, unthinkingly play into the hands of exclusivist minorities that come to this country as economic immigrants and then sometimes feel not connected with the rest of society. It's natural for them to congregate or come together with the people that they know, or speak the same language and have the same cultural practices. That's very natural. The politicians ought to be actually going to them and encouraging them to kind of disintegrate those ghettos and move out and integrate more. But by going there and not questioning those things and simply saying, I like you the way you are, and I'm going to dress the same as you are and pray the same with you for a day, I think we're on a very dangerous and a slippery slope. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
I understand you're familiar with the law.
Somewhat.
So my question is, there's a phrase, in good faith and in decent language. Can you explain what in good faith means and in decent language means?
Nobody's asked me that question ever. So I will try. Faith ought not to have a faith or a religious connotation. The word faith doesn't always have to do with religion. I think in good faith, we place our faith in something, in laws, right? in equality, in justice. That faith isn't the faith you might think Christianity or Sikhism or something else is. So when you say in good faith, one could argue that it may have started as a religious thing. But I think the way we use the expression in good faith, at least when I use it, I did this in good faith, which means I did this honestly, believing it to be the legitimate thing to do. Decent language? Yeah. Unlike Trump.
Yes, I was thinking about the subject myself before I came, and I have a similar viewpoint. It seems, though, that it's the model of secularism that we have in Canada that maybe needs to be rethought. It seems that we have a multi-faith model of secularism, so that in our public institutions, we have religious representatives on the boards of some of those institutions. And I'm wondering if you have another model for that. For instance, our university has religious colleges, so the people from the religious colleges have representation in the administration of the university at various levels. A secular university might not have religious colleges. You might be able to study religion in a department of history or in a religious studies program, but might not have those colleges there, because those colleges then get representation on administrative boards.
Yeah, I would differ with you on that, because academia, if it means anything to me, means independence. And if in the context of the academia you want to now create a caste system and say faith institutions or, like colleges of divinity or others shouldn't be able to exist as part of the universities, then you're taking a part of the discourse that happens in those universities away. And if they're going to be part of those institutions, then they ought to be represented like the others are. And I'm sure at the University of British Columbia, I know that there's a college attached to it. I don't think that they're that powerful to be able to influence the rest of society to the detriment of promotion of secularism. I mean, they have a point of view. It's a legitimate point of view as an academic interest. And I don't believe that we should be saying to them they should be out of there and have something separate. That's my view. Maybe uneducated, but.
Thank you. Hi, first of all, thanks for being here. It's very stimulating and interesting stuff. I apologize if this is repetitive. It seems like something you might have addressed on your blog or elsewhere. I'm sure you would understand that the Trinity Western University controversy is felt pretty keenly in this room and by myself personally. And with your legal background, I'm curious what your take is basically on that division of religious freedom versus what I would call equality rights. In my mind, I think the equality rights should trump religious freedom in this case. But I'd be very curious to hear your perspective and get as technical as you like, because I love that sort of thing.
You know, at an emotional level, two of my sons are lawyers, and when the BC bar was voting on this, I talked to them. I said, you know, you should go vote Trinity down. And they were eager to do that anyway. But I think that I believe that under the umbrella of religion, or religious freedom, there comes a time when in a society, or in society at large across the world, one needs to stop discrimination. And that's how I come at it, personally. And I believe that while I appreciate the hesitance that religious people have about this issue at Trinity Western, I believe they're wrong. They're on the wrong side of history. They should be open enough to say, we believe this, but we're not going to put this restraint on students coming into this university. That's how you live together. And I think that they're wrong in saying we are going to impose this restriction in the name of religious freedom, and the rest of society should just accept it. And I think that I can believe what I want, but I don't think that I should be imposing that restraint on an academic institution where freedom and equality is what it's all about.
I would be interested in hearing more about political correctness, and I know you've done quite a lot, and you're touching on that this morning, of course, but I'd like to hear more about how you define that. I happen to agree with everything you said about the politicians rushing around pandering to various religions, which I think is part of that, but I would like to hear some more. Thank you.
Well, I can show you the bruises I have from the last 6 months or so. I did a piece on my blog in good faith because I actually believe that we, particularly majority Canadians, which are white Canadians, particularly men, out of concern for feelings of people like me who don't look white or are white, they self-censor and they don't always speak frankly. Now, when I wrote that, that was pre-Trump, and I didn't have Trump in mind. But I still believe that anybody who believes that we in Canada now, in politics or in the social justice advocacy areas, that we have a free and frank discussion of issues, needs to wake up. We don't. We self-censor. And that doesn't mean that we should be hurtful or have callous disregard for others' feelings. But the fact is that we should be able to address the issues without always being worried that somebody might be thin-skinned enough to feel offended. And yeah, I have a very good friend who is an Indian politician in India, and his term for that is there is a lot of competitive offendedness going around in the world nowadays. Like, I'm more offended than the next person about something. If I'm not more offended, then I'm not more just. Then I'm not better than the next person. And I think that needs to stop. You don't have always to be offended and asking for apologies. And we need to, more important than an apology is if a person actually addresses the conduct or the problem at the core of that. And I actually, when I did that blog, I think I had maybe 15,000 hits, and I don't even remember how many comments. And I actually stopped the comments on my blog at that time because I can't address them. I don't have the time to. And the other thing on social media is that people feel free to be hateful. People stop being thoughtful. In fact, they exactly made my point that that when they are in the anonymity of the social media world, their true feelings come out. If you're face to face with them, they will never be that hateful, and so which means people don't say what they feel. I mean, I don't mean that people should be hateful publicly to each other. I simply mean we should be free. And our politicians are the worst in that regard, because they are always looking at, not offending this group and not offending that group, and everything is all right and we have no problems. And that kind of attitude doesn't make a country better. That's my feeling, and I got told off for that. By CBC too.
Thank you. To a certain extent, this follows on from what you were saying about Trinity Western University, and that's what's your take on religious schools that we have here in BC? There's a lot of independent schools, and then they're all various Christian denominations mostly, and then there's the Khalsa one, and I don't know what else there is. The other thing, this is years and years ago, when my kids, we were living in Montreal at the time, and you had then, when you sent kids to school, you had to choose French Catholic, French Protestant, English Catholic, English Protestant, or Jewish. And you had to put them down into one of those categories. And we actually put our kids into French Catholic. We're not French or Catholic. But it was just that this was the nearest school and all their friends went there.
You were defined.
And actually, the attitude there, because it was the sort of fallback, it was the place where everyone went who didn't fall into one of the other categories. They were quite accepting of all sorts of different viewpoints. And like what you say Trinity Western ought to do, that is, they said, this is what we believe, but if you don't, that's fine. Okay, so anyway, the first question was, what do you think about all these various religious schools in BC?
Well, I don't recall everything about my past life, because, memory is very tricky. It forgets the things it doesn't want to remember. But I remember when I was part of the government in British Columbia, the platform of the NDP was to stop funding to private schools, if I remember correctly. And then when we got into power, and we knew that we weren't going to be able to do that, because tradition sometimes is pretty hard to deal with and contend with. If you ask me ideally what we should have, we have in this country a constitutional issue. You have embedded in the constitutional traditions and conventions, and perhaps even in all the agreements that put Canada together, that Ontario funds Catholic schools. And so it's pretty hard to undo that history unless we come to a peaceful collective decision that we should actually stop that practice. And those who feel otherwise will always be a hindrance to that ending of that tradition. But if you ask me, ideally what should be, I don't believe state has a business, any state should have any business in helping faith-based schools in any way, shape, or form. Churches, temples, mosques, they have tons of money. They can help those schools. I don't think that public tax dollars should be going to those schools. They might argue that, look, we are people of certain faiths and we pay taxes too. Therefore, our children should get some subsidy from the government. That's an argument, but I think as a principle, we should actually aspire to end this practice if we can. And I know that it'd be almost next to impossible to do because of the constitutional issues. Thank you.
Thank you for coming, and I agree with most of what you said. And I have a question regarding immigration. The way we mostly grow our population in Canada is through immigration. I believe we accept around 300,000 immigrants per year, something around that. When I immigrated, I went through a test based on the point system, and they asked me about my educational background, my economic background, my business background, and so on. They never asked me what I thought about women's rights, about gay rights, and so on, which are shaped by, in many cases, by religion. So I thought about, what people call here Canadian values, and I don't think we should call them Canadian values. We should call them human values. They are not just unique to Canada. In other countries, like in the Netherlands, after some religious violence, specifically the killing of Theo van Gogh, they changed their immigration policy a little bit by trying to, in some way, filter immigrants based on what their religious prejudices were. They show them a movie where they show partially naked people, gay people holding hands, and all these kind of things which they are forced to watch before applying for immigration. So they kind of try to dissuade immigrants that don't agree with those values from immigrating to the Netherlands. Do you think that our immigration system should be exclusively based on the economic potential of the immigrant, or we should take into account what that immigrant values as regarding human values? Should that be a consideration in the qualification process to immigrate to Canada?
Well, I don't think that you can actually do a values test. I think that that's just totally abhorrent to what we as Canadians stand for. But what you can do, let's be practical. Very few people from Europe want to come to Canada. And so you have to access immigrants from the rest of the world if you want to bring more immigrants. And that is the reality. And from my perspective, what Leach is talking about is just absurd. That's almost like Trump. But what we need to do is, once we invite people into this country, we should make clear to them that they have an onus to actually understand the political culture of this country, the values that drive the political culture. We aren't perfect. We should say we messed up the lives of our Aboriginal people over centuries. Canada isn't a perfect society. It's more perfect than it used to be. So we can't be holier than thou. We understand there are human failings in each and every society. But I don't believe that you can do a values test. I don't believe what Netherlands is doing would be acceptable to Canadians. It's not acceptable to me. I think we should have immigrants come into the country based on need for skills. But then, once people are here based on the need, our need for their skills, politicians have an obligation, more than anybody else, to say to them publicly, just like Angela Merkel is saying in Germany, you come, you change. Because if you come and you don't change, then you're simply coming for the economic opportunities and not the rest of the quality of life that we have in this country. Equality, freedom, liberal democracy. And I think that that's something we haven't been doing as Canadians. I heard Justin Trudeau mention recently somewhere, and I can't recall where it was, the need for immigrants to undertake some change on their own part. That needs to be done more often. Our public leaders, our political leaders, need to understand, there is I don't know whether the CBC is made public, but they talked to me about a recent study or poll that they have. We Canadians think that we are very liberal, very open, very accepting. 69% of Canadians are now saying immigrants need to change when they come to this country. And in the United States of America, that number is about 53%. Why is that? in America, people understand that immigrants come and change more than they do in Canada. And people understand in Canada, when immigrants come, they don't change. So if we want a peaceful and harmonious society, the political leadership of this country, opposition and government alike, need to actually talk about this publicly. Need for integration, not need for assimilation. You know, I'm not interested in changing people's religion or changing people's, you can't change my skin color, right? I mean, I am who I am. But it is the value system. It is how we treat women, how we treat other minorities, how accepting we are of each other's differences. The fact is that Canadians were more accepting of immigrants 15, 20 years ago, and they're less accepting now. And that is because the political leadership has done a very poor job of impressing upon newcomers to be more open to change. And when you impress upon newcomers the need to be more open to change, you also say to the Canadian society, you need to be more open too.
I just want to mention what Rodney said. I grew up in Montreal too, where those were the choices. My parents, who were Jewish, sent me to the Jewish school, although all the kids went to the English Protestant school because that was the one at the end of the block. But it's different. Montreal, well, Quebec, it is different in Montreal. It is now the Montreal School Board, whereas it used to be the Montreal Protestant School Board. The Protestant School Board of Greater Montreal, that was it. And they even had badges. And interestingly, when I went to high school, only 10% of the kids in my Protestant high school only 10% were not Jewish. Everybody else, 90% were Jewish. But it was still a Protestant school. Anyway, that's just the way it was then, but now it's different. You were talking about how you feel that Parliament should be a distance between both religion and politics. Am I incorrect that at the end of December there is a tree or lights or something to celebrate, and they're not celebrating the solstice, they're celebrating Christmas? Well, and if so, but even if not, how would you see this? What would it look like to have this, the divide that you were talking about between the two?
Well, I remember saying at the beginning that, holding religious celebrations isn't necessarily a good thing. But I think ultimately, it's from my perspective, and I may have a different opinion from you. I give you my experience. When I first became an MLA in '91, we just used to wish season's greetings. After a couple of years, you used to send cards to people saying season's greetings. After a couple of years, I realized that there's absolutely nothing wrong with saying Merry Christmas to people who believe that it's important for them, or Happy Hanukkah. And that's from, Christmas is not, like my little children when they were growing up, 3 sons, they needed a Christmas tree at home. They wanted a Christmas tree because all the other children in the neighborhood had a Christmas tree. We used to bring Christmas tree and light up, and I know my grandchildren, the 2 of them live with me, their mother dresses up a Christmas tree, decorates one every year. And we're not Christians. From my perspective, I think that if you have that as a tradition, it's not necessarily now, for me, a religious tradition. It's almost close to being secular. I'm not a Christian. In my home, there's a Christmas tree. I don't think that's like taking the. There's something in the Quebec legislature that's embedded there from some time ago. I don't think you need to undo history, but you don't need to actually follow that historical tradition and say now everyone from all faiths can come and have their celebrations on Parliament Hill. I think that you will create a ruckus if you undid the Christian Christmas tree But that doesn't mean that you have to add to that and say now we should do one on Eid and we should do one on something else, and because then you're going on a slippery slope. There's something called history, and then there's something called you add to that history, and I'm not in favor of adding to that history. I understand where it comes from.
Then that's the same as the politicians going to the different religions and not going to a church.
I don't think, well, I may, you know, I don't have to agree with you on everything. I'm simply saying to you, I don't believe that the lighting of a Christmas tree on Parliament Hill, to me, sends a religious message, and I'm not a Christian. And there is a Christmas tree in all my 3 sons' homes at Christmas, and they're not Christians. They don't even go to a Sikh temple unless they go to a wedding or something. They're totally kind of a-religious. And I think that in that sense, there's part of history of a particular place. If you can strip it from its religious sort of part, it can remain as a secular symbol of the history of the country as it was. And I'm troubled about increasing it. If you had, Sikhs doing their celebrations of Parliament Hill, then Muslims doing their celebration of Parliament, and then something else. Buddhists come, they do it, and then the Jewish community would say, we want to do it. You'd be doing about sort of one religious celebration a month. Then it would become a quasi-religious institution and not the Parliament that we know.
This is not, I got a couple questions, but a comment on the Christmas tree. Due to circumstance, I was in a Sikh household just before Christmas. The gentleman claimed to be very devout Sikh, although he was not the 5 Ks. And they had probably the most elaborate, biggest Christmas tree I ever seen in my life. It was huge, and the presents were just beyond what I would ever think of doing. But I said, well, he said, oh, the kids like it. My questions are, do you think Canada needs a constitutional clause that is more in line with what the Americans have, a stronger separation of church and state? Or would it be better if we just let that evolve through court action and other things? And the second question was, should church properties be exempt from taxes?
Since I'm not running for anything, I can say that. If you want to take away the tax-exempt status from churches, then you'll have to take away tax-exempt status from all non-profits. Where do you stop? Non-profits do good activism, good social justice work. If you simply said nobody gets any tax exemption, then I think you could argue. But we have so many non-government organizations, non-profits doing very good work. You can't just focus on churches.
And the constitutional.
Oh, the Constitution. I'm a great believer that laws don't necessarily solve a problem, particularly law on secularism, law on separation of church and state. I think that is something that has to evolve. And the politicians should be careful, because Canada of today isn't the Canada of 1900s or even 1960s when I came to this country. There was diversity here long before the whites came. I mean, you have Aboriginal diversity, 50 languages on the West Coast being spoken by the Aboriginal community. So the diversity didn't begin with immigration after Trudeau. Diversity was here when the whites arrived here. And the diversity has become more complex, more pervasive. It's now from all over the world, from all different religions, all different ethnicities, all different language groups. And as that increases, the need for separation of church and state is going to become a lot more important. It wasn't as obvious when you didn't have other faiths in large numbers present in this country. And in fact, if politicians don't become more active on this issue and more understanding and more involved, as I just said in India, I said, you guys need secularism to survive as a country because it has 1 million minorities, and if you don't have secularism sort of underpinning the whole government, you will have 1 million mutinies on your hand. And I think that Canada is a much smaller country in terms of population. It's more manageable, it's more affluent, but still, it's not always going to be like this. I mean, there's more diversity coming. And if there's more diversity coming, you have to be more alert to these issues. And Canada has been kind of sleeping its way through these issues. It can't do that anymore. But I don't think law is the answer.
I guess about the Christmas tree, I think of it as a pagan symbol of the wooded West. And I feel like this is part of the wooded West, and it's got a romanticism to it that is beyond Christianity. It's pre-Christian, whatever. Anyhow, my question is a monarchy. I guess you have to pledge to the Queen or something when you're the Premier or when you're an MP or whatever. And I was wondering how you feel about immigrants having to pledge to the Queen when they're in their citizenship ceremony. Do you think that's something that also have to be excised from Canada, whatever?
I'm a lot more pragmatic on those kinds of issues. I mean, I just think that what works, we should keep it. And from my perspective, monarchy doesn't cost Canada anything. It has a system that has served it well over the centuries. If you don't have a monarch, then the Governor General would become the president, and the president would have. Right now, I'm actually a lot happier with Trudeau's repatriation of the Constitution. That constitutionally we can change all the laws. We don't need to depend on UK Parliament. That's real freedom. I think monarchy is just it's an institution that majority of the Canadians actually support. I wouldn't necessarily want to create a disruption in the life of the country with an issue that doesn't matter. If it mattered really to how the democracy functions, whether justice is done or not, whether there's social justice in the country or not, if it mattered, then I'd say let's get rid of it. It doesn't matter. It's just a symbol. And from my perspective, let it be.
Good morning. It's very refreshing to have an ex-politician provide the ideas you do, obviously. We're in the minority. Well, no, I guess by some of the surveys, you probably heard we did a survey, and BC is one of the most secular places in Canada. What are we at, about 70% or something? And yet we have a premier that consults the Bible when she has to make big decisions. So kind of a contradiction there. But I just wanted to ask you a question. I was just in terms of some of the discussions we've had today about you're saying there's nothing wrong with it, say, having the lights on Parliament Hill and so forth, and you have a Christmas tree at home. But I think there's a contradiction in that because it's your home, and you can do whatever you want. And if you remember the famous Seinfeld show where the Costanzas had a steel pole to celebrate, that's what they did. It was a mockery, I think a mockery out of all of that. But to me, that's the contradiction. It's a tradition of 100 years ago when this was a 99% Christian country, people were all the beliefs. If 70% of Canadians are now secular, why would you have lights for Christians? Why wouldn't you have all of them, the very same thing you're talking about? So I think that becomes a contradiction, because if we really want a secular country, then you don't use public things. And the one thing you didn't mention, we have a chapel in our Parliament building, don't we? I think. And in fact, there's an active group of parliamentarians that goes to the chapel every day. Why would we, I think we do that, I can check it. Why would we spend 1 cent of public money for that if supposedly the government is supposed to be for everybody and represent all religions?
I wasn't aware of the chapel. If there's a chapel, I agree with you. It's time that it shouldn't exist. I don't know whether you remember the controversy about Van der Zam renting a room, allowing a Christian group to come and pray. I was young in those days, and British Columbians just sort of spoke with one voice and say, no, we shouldn't do that. So, you know, my view on that is very clear. I wasn't aware of it, but if there's a chapel, maybe it's time to say goodbye, unless you want to have others have their quote-unquote chapels in Parliament, which wouldn't be a very good thing. But, you know, Christmas tree is, as I said, you know, if you're looking for consistency in human affairs, you're not going to find it. And sometimes it leads to results that may not be what you really were looking for. From my perspective, when you come to a country and there are certain embedded traditions, unless they harm someone, unless they stand in the way of equality, social justice, and progress, I would say let them be. You know, Trinity Western tradition of restraining certain conduct is wrong. I don't find anything wrong with a Christmas tree out on the lawns of the Parliament of Canada, because I think that's a tradition that's been going on for a long time. It doesn't hurt anybody. It doesn't demean other religious groups. I'm pretty pragmatic. I'm not consistent on everything.
You keep traditions that are out of date. Like I agree with you. If it's a good tradition, whatever. But if a tradition runs out of time because it's outdated, just like our values toward women, they couldn't vote, and then women got to vote. Well, we could have said, well, we've had this tradition of women not voting for thousands of years, so of course let's keep it.
But a Christmas tree is no hindrance to equality.
No, I love my Christmas.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming. It's good to have you here. Yeah. Some of the comments that Kirsten and Murray have been making, I'd like to echo, but say them just a little bit differently. I agree that change has to come slow, and it can't be done, needs to be done somewhat pragmatically, given money, time. We need to eat away and erode some of the historical injustices. So for me, a compromise, because I don't want to see 50 celebrations in Parliament Hill, let's just have a holiday tree, and on some day, starting maybe with the 21st, where the solstice starts, we can have the secular groups come and put their symbols on the tree. There's 150 branches on this tree, and then the Jews can come and put a menorah on, the Christians can come and put ornaments on, but we call it a holiday tree, and it represents the diversity of Canada. And we do that over 3 or 4 days. We don't give them the whole lawn for some witchcraft celebration, okay? But we do, because that is not practical. But we do start to rename and re-symbolize the secularization of this country. And I think to call it a Christmas tree can change if we do it gradually and use different words, because words are really important in what we do, as are these symbols, okay? But we don't have to do it all at once. But we can be creative, just like I said. You can call it something different and let everybody join in and put their little ornament on, and the photographers are there, and so they're in their native dress or whatever. That's cool. But we got to start changing it to the secularity that's been mentioned. I personally think we need to expand the laissez-faire concept of the French, which is to separate out the public and private spheres of our life. And I like the definition that one judge came up with in Quebec, if I can be so to read it, and that is that the state is not to use its power to promote the participation of believers or non-believers in the public life to the detriment of others. Now, those are some words that if Wittgenstein gets involved, he's going to ask, well, what does promote mean? And what does detriment mean? So we have to have a fair and enlightened judicial system to take a statement like that and keep acting on it across the years.
I don't think you need an answer from me, but your statement is self-explanatory.
Thank you so much for coming. It's very nice to hear you speak. I just wanted to know what your take would be on what's happening in Richmond just now with the issue of Chinese signage overtaking everything, it seems. If I lived in Richmond, I'd have to be honest to say I would be very resentful that now everywhere I look I see signs that I can't read. And I don't know how that came about or why it wasn't nipped in the bud, or when we had the issue of Strata Corporation wanting all their meetings in Chinese, and so that the non-speaking Chinese people wouldn't understand if they came to the meeting. That seems, anyway, I don't live there, and so, you know, it's easy for me to just sort of ignore it, but it is an issue, and I'd be curious to know what your take is on that.
I'd actually done a short blog on it in those days when the meeting controversy came up. I believe that you know, holding, when you have non-Chinese speakers in the meeting and members of the strata, it was just wrong to have a meeting in Mandarin exclusively, and the interpretation isn't always the best way of communicating. Much is lost in interpretation. But you know, the general controversy in Richmond, I don't believe laws will change that. I mean, I think that's again a weakness of the civic government. They have rarely, other than one or two of them, they have rarely spoken out encouraging the merchants and others to have signs in both languages, English and whatever else they want to use. And we don't need to say half the sign should be in language, half the size. It could be, you know, people should be encouraged. And the problem in Richmond has been that the council has been very, very reluctant to speak up, other than a couple of them, to speak up on this issue. And I understand that it's changing. They passed a bylaw recently. I don't remember the details of the bylaw, at least for some signs, saying half the space in the sign should be in English and the other half Chinese. You know, look, I think it's the problem, because when we have immigrants coming into the country, we as politicians and public leaders don't make any demands on the newcomers. Demands not in a rough, you know, legalistic way. We don't say to them, look, we expect you to change a little. Like when I came to this country in 1968, and I actually say to people that if I had come to Canada in 1973, instead of coming to Canada in 1968, I wouldn't be who I am. Because by 1973, thousands of more Indo-Canadians had come, you know, Indian immigrants had come. The institutions were beginning to evolve in the community that you didn't need to speak English, you didn't need to learn English, you didn't need to go to the neighborhood house, that you began to kind of develop somewhat separately and on your own. And when I came to this country, the Indian community was very small. It was very well integrated into the larger society. And, you know, I remember our first home, you know, we would have white neighbors on either side, and we would, you know, exchange chicken curry for whatever they were making and talk to them. And I knew some English because I came from England. And if I hadn't come into that kind of milieu, I wouldn't be who I am. And I think it's important, And the Indians of that time, that we call Indo-Canadians, used to actually say to people when they came, like they would say to me, older men, son, go get an education, go to university, you're young. And going to university is one of the better ways of integrating, going to school, obviously, with other people. And I think that politicians are failing in their duty. And that's why sometimes they don't like what I say, because I believe, well, they feel that I have more license to say the things I can because I'm brown. But I think they have an obligation to say to people, we welcome you, we love you, this is diversity, this is wonderful. But to make this statement, just to say diversity is a great strength, well, that's foolish to say that unless you make that diversity work by living with each other, talking to each other, sharing with each other, arguing peacefully with each other, working to improve the neighborhood with each other. If diversity isn't that mingling and living together, then diversity can become a huge weakness over time. I mean, I remember, I don't know whether you remember, I remember the Liverpool riots long time ago. They had a racial element to them. And that is because if you don't have integration going on, if you don't have encouragement from civic, provincial, and federal public leaders to say we are one country, one society, one people, we should integrate, we should learn from each other and be open. We say to Canadians, you need to be open to immigration because we need immigration. And then we should say to immigrants that they should be open to some change as well. And we don't do that. I mean, that's the big problem. Sorry for just talking endless.
Thank you very much for coming. I really respect you from a long time. And I want to ask you a question because I love Canada so much. But now I must say this. Do you think, I have several questions, but I will try to make it very short. Do you think America, and I have to ask you a question about UN too, because there's a problem going on in Sri Lanka. They had 30 years of war. I think it's all over the websites, everything. They had a majority Buddhist, Sinhalese Buddhist in the country, and there was Tamil Hindus, Tamil Catholics, Christians will say. Now they want UN and America, all the European countries, they want the Sri Lanka's constitution to be changed, and they want the Buddhism thrown out of the constitution. Now it's a big problem. They had 30 years of war, first between Tamils and Sinhalese. They said it was terrorism. Then they say it's a communal violence or something. And I think the politicians, even America, they want to create a religious war now because the war is over now. They can't sell their arms to Sri Lanka. And politicians should be, I love Canada, but the constitution, it was more than decades and decades the Buddhism was in Sri Lanka, in the constitution, everything. Why UN and all the Americans and everybody trying to change that constitution? I want to ask you your idea. Let them have their Buddhism in the country, right? They allow the other religions to have their own rights. They never disgrace or say you can't believe in this religion or that religion. Now the people are fighting, like UN has double standards. America has double standards. Everywhere they create war in the world. So do you think the UN or the America doing the correct thing about this religion and politics? I don't know whether I gave you the correct, I don't know how to ask the question.
I'm not an expert on Sri Lanka, although I should be. I came from India. It's a country sort of below. I was in Sri Lanka in 2005 at the time of tsunami, and I did speak to, along with Paul Martin, group of Tamil politicians and the government politicians. So I'm aware a little bit. I'm not going into the history and the problems in Sri Lanka, but just as a general principle, I don't believe that, from my perspective, you should have a religion in the constitution. Then you're a theocracy, and you're not really a true democracy. And then you're like Pakistan; it's an Islamic republic. It's not a republic, and you have minorities. And that's one of the fights in India. I mean, India is a secular country by its constitution, and the right-wing religious groups have been wanting to change the nature of government, not necessarily changing the constitution. And I believe that if you have a secular constitution, you don't have the mention of a religion. You are making a statement to the rest of the country that everybody is included in the country, in the nation. And if Buddhists are a majority, a tiny Tamil minority can't be a threat to a large Buddhist country if you make them feel included. I mean, those are the issues. Sometimes legalistic responses aren't helpful.
Thank you. So regarding my previous question about immigration, you said that
I know you were dissatisfied.
Yes, so you wouldn't do what Netherlands is doing. So you said that it wouldn't be acceptable to do what Netherlands is doing. So Netherlands is basically making potential immigrants aware of the kind of values that are respected in the Netherlands. What's wrong with making them aware of those values? They are not telling them you're not allowed. They are saying these are the kind of values we accept, and telling a potential immigrant that we don't accept honor killings in Canada before they arrive, not after. What's wrong with that?
That's not what you had said. You had said they are testing the immigrants. They're showing them films. That's what you had said. No, that's what you had said. No, you remember saying that though. That's what you had said. And then they're checking their responses and then figuring out whether the responses are positive or not.
I didn't say that.
That's what you had said. But you may not admit that, but that's what you said. But no, hold on. But that's what I heard, and I responded that no, I wouldn't want to do that. Of course, you want to make sure that, like one of the things I did many years ago, I did a paper for a professor at UBC. She wanted some research done in the Indian community, and I did some. And I made an argument that we should actually have a crash course for new immigrants coming into the country as to the values. That's one of the first things. It should be a mandatory course as they come in. They should have to attend it and talk about political, cultural values of liberal democracy, egalitarian society, and all of those things. So I am not. I mean, nobody. I have. If you know my history, I probably have spoken out more against honor killings and female genital mutilation and all of those things. Those aren't values that are accepted in Canada or ought to be accepted anywhere in the world, not just Canada. And so I agree with you that we should tell new immigrants as they are being interviewed that this is what Canada is, that we have gay and lesbian equality, that we have women's equality, that women can pursue any occupation or profession that they like, but not to test the way you were talking about. I responded to your tests. Thank you.
Just going back to your comments about the tax consideration and churches and religions and nonprofits. I'm sure in your lifetime you probably met David Suzuki, people from the Greenpeace or whatever. I think they would be highly offended in you creating a false equivalency that they're similar to churches, because I mean environmental groups, non-profits, most of them are using science to deal with environmental, you're absolutely right, deal with environmental, social issues.
Most of them.
Right, okay, most of them, and they should have more power, as you know, the last government tried to stop. Churches are selling a scam to have a personal relationship with a friend upstairs. Now, that's a pretty big difference. And we need progressive nonprofits more than we've ever needed them. You would agree, not only here, but all over the world, because we need these forces of changes. We don't need people being sold and not having to pay any income taxes or any kind of property taxes on one of the biggest scams that's ever been on humanity for thousands of years.
Well, you know, all nonprofits aren't secular, and not all are scientific. And you can't say nonprofits, only secular and scientific. You'll have very few left, honestly. And I know, and that's not to belittle activism on the green front or on the other front, but for some of these activists, you know, their activism becomes a religion too, almost to the point of being fanatics. And what do you call them? I'm not talking about David Suzuki, by the way. So I think that you know, it's a very slippery slope. When you, no matter how well intentioned, when you begin to demarcate compartments and say this we allow and this we shouldn't allow in nonprofits, and churches are nonprofits, it's a very slippery slope. I would hold on to my argument.
You talked about separating politics and religion, and you've obviously been in politics for a long time, but one of the difficulties is religious groups have so much finance, have so much money and historical influence that they're able to speak to politicians and get access. I want to know sort of two things. First, what's your experience with religious lobbies, if you could comment on that at all? You don't have to, if it's confidential or anything. And the second is, what advice would you have for individuals and organizations that want to promote a greater secularism like you're talking about, like us?
Well, you know, I don't have an experience with religious lobbies because from the 1980s, of my experience with religion, I think no religious group would want to lobby me because they thought that I was somewhat more secular than most politicians. Sorry, what was the other question?
What would you recommend groups like ours and individuals who want to promote that secular system do?
Well, I think that you should lobby. I think you should talk to your MLAs, talk to your MPs, have meetings with them, and you know, all groups come and talk to you when you're an MP or an MLA. And one of the things you learn is that they come fast and furious, and they have issues and demands that you know that they make of public at large and the public purse. And if you don't do that as a group that is interested in a particular kind of society, then your view doesn't get heard. You know, in terms of my experiences, by the way, I can tell you my experiences with the 1980s with the extremist groups amongst the Sikhs is well known, but less well known is the story. We were the first jurisdiction in North America, when I was the Attorney General, to pass family legislation for gay and lesbian equality, and also pension legislation for gay and lesbian equality in civil service, at least. And I was the Attorney General, so I had to shepherd those bills through the House. And so what do I see the next day? You know, Archbishop Adam Exner, whose name you might know from the 90s, and a well-known president of the Sikh Temple, and a couple of other religious leaders on the front page of the Vancouver Sun denouncing me. And the argument that the Archbishop made was very interesting. The argument he made was, you know, you want to give gay and lesbian common law couples rights of survivorship. Why won't you give the same right of survivorship to families looking after each other, for a sister looking after a husband, a brother, or a, you know, somebody, a cousin looking after another sibling or cousin in terms of disability. Why wouldn't you give the right to survivorship? I said, you know, you want to expand the rights of survivorship. Thank you. So make the argument. We've done the gay and lesbians. Now we can do the others. I'm happy that you made the argument. But anyway, they, you know, so that's been the experience. Look, I mean, you know, when religious groups speak, they're like any groups. They have a certain turf that they're trying to protect. And it's like any other activists. They have a certain turf they're trying to protect. And, you know, one of the things I've always enjoyed, and I say this is my weakness, I've always enjoyed reading the letter that the Catholic bishops occasionally issue on the state of the nation in this country, about poverty, about how inequality needs to be dealt with. And I think that those when they speak in those letters with a certain authority and a certain voice, I welcome that kind of intervention, and I cherish it, because it's important to hear those voices, and they're usually pretty good. You must admit, when they issue those letters. Thank you.
Yes, I've very much enjoyed your company for an hour or two. The federal government recently passed legislation on euthanasia. My question is, what is it about the parliamentary system that prevents the government from producing laws that people actually like?
Well, because as many people as like the law also dislike the law. Generally, it's about 50-50, generally, most laws. And politicians are always looking at the polls and the next election, and things are difficult to move. That's why. I think that's why it took so long on this issue. I mean, this has been a long debate from Sue Rodriguez' time to now. It's been a long struggle. And that's true with the most difficult legislation, because euthanasia, it's easier said than actually understood, because you are dealing with huge issues around vulnerable Canadians, with people with disabilities and others who sometimes can't speak for themselves at that moment. And so I can understand why it took so long. I won't fault the government for taking its time. Those are very difficult issues. And I'm glad I wasn't there for it.
And this is our last question.
Do you think there would be any interest in our parliament for a parliamentary humanist group, cross-party group that would meet, say, once a month?
I'm sure there would be. If it's an agnostic group, they might join it more so than if it's an atheist group, because most politicians don't want to say, I don't believe in that. So I mean, there's a slight difference, right? So, like most of my life, I go to religious places when invited. I go to historic religious places on my own, like, centuries-old mosques or temples back in India. Just like I took my children there in 1983, 3 of them, and they asked me, why are we here? Whose place is this? And I simply said, well, this place belonged to your ancestors. I didn't want to get into religion, didn't want to get into God, but it is part of our history. And so people in politics are shy of taking positions on issues that they don't need to take positions on. And if humanist group simply means silence on religion, but talk about secularism and progress and social justice, I'm sure they'd be willing to join. But if you made atheism the central focus of it, they might not, because then they have to answer questions.
Can you name names?
No, thank you. Thank you.
Well, Giselle, this was very interesting. You can tell from all the questions that we have that people are really interested in this topic. So I'd like to thank you on behalf of our association for sharing this.